Hi, welcome to Philosophy 101. I'm Chrisanne Moore, and tonight we're doing Program 4, In the Beginning and Taoism. So tonight we'll be covering two chapters. We'll be covering Chapter 4, which is In the Beginning, and then we will go on to Chapter 5, Taoism. So at this point, we know that philosophy is love of wisdom. We know that wisdom is knowledge of how to live the best of all possible lives and being able to live it consistently. We realize that an essential part of living the best of all possible lives is knowing what is right and wrong behavior. It's answering that question, that essential question, how ought I live? And not only do we need to know right and wrong and good and bad behavior in order to answer that question, how ought I live, we also need to know the reasoning behind our moral decisions, and that is ethics. So, in this search for the best of all possible lives, in this pursuit of happiness, we have learned that although there are no definitive answers to the great philosophical questions, and therefore no definitive answers to moral questions, there are answers which are considered better than others. Those are those answers that are reasoned answers. At least those are the answers that philosophers think are the best possible answers. And so now you should also know how to construct the best possible answers. You should know how to use inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, feelings, intuitions, perhaps even dreams and visions. But realize that each of those needs to be tested, because each of those ways of knowing are flawed. And so that we need to subject our inductive reasoning, our deductive reasoning, our intuition, our instinct, our feelings, our dreams, our visions, and test them to see if the knowledge they're giving us is reliable. And those tests include the coherence test of truth. Does this idea fit in with my other reliable beliefs? Then there's the experiential test of truth. Does this knowledge bear out in my experience? And finally, the pragmatic test of truth. Is this information practical? In other words, does it make my life better? And does it make the lives of the people around me better? Okay, so now we know philosophy, wisdom, morality, ethics, and how to formulate the best possible answers. So now we're ready to look at those ethical theories that have been developed over time. We will be looking at those theories that have been developed by philosophers. This is extremely important because the answers that these philosophers have come up with have been brilliant. Now, that doesn't mean that they're your answers or that you need to agree with them. However, their answers should inspire you and they should inform you. And by contending with their answers, by agreeing or disagreeing with their answers, you'll be able to formulate your own best possible answer. In addition, the answers of these philosophers have shaped culture and history. So by learning the answers that these philosophers have developed, you will also understand more about the world that you live in. And finally, as we look at the answers of various philosophers over history, you will find that many of these philosophers agree on some fundamental aspects of morality, and thus information or evidence will be provided for the existence of a universal moral theory. So, in order to begin that journey of looking at ethical theories, we are going to begin literally at the beginning. We are going to look at the Neolithic period, which started in 10,000 to 8,000 BC, the very earliest stages of stable communities. This is the time when human communities began to create stable agricultural communities. Now, it is important to look at this period in order to dispel some misinterpretations of human nature that came out of ideas about these early communities. And these misinterpretations of data, these misinterpretations of ideas about human nature have been incorporated into very persuasive ethical theories, even though that information is, at the very least, incomplete. You see, many of us have this idea of primitive humans as brutal and savage. We have this idea that in the very earliest humans were only concerned with their own desires and needs. And showed no concern for the desires and needs of others. This actually was the vision of Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes was a philosopher who lived from 1588 to 1679. And he proposed that the various early humans lived in what he called a state of nature, in which each of these humans, pursuing their own needs and desires, were in a state of constant war. This Hobbesian view of nature, let's take a look at this, says that war is the natural state of human beings. So it was considered that because war was the natural state of human beings, that as human beings began to form these earliest communities, morality was developed only that these communities might exist. In other words, just so human beings could alleviate an impossible situation of constant warfare, human beings agreed to live by moral rules only so that these communities could be formed. This view of morality is called a social contract view of morality. So this is a Hobbesian view as well. Morality is merely a social contract. So to alleviate these unlivable conditions of constant warfare between human beings that are only concerned about satisfying their own desires, morality is developed to allow for these communities to be stable and to exist. Morality is merely a social contract. According to Hobbes and others, in addition to this fact, human beings would only follow those moral laws when they thought it was in their interest to do so. So, if you thought you could get away with it, if you thought that you wouldn't get caught, human beings would break moral laws. Therefore, Hobbes and others believe that a vengeful deity was necessary in order to impose morality on humans, or else a very powerful leader would be necessary who would threaten human beings into following these social contract, into this moral law. Now, this is a view of morality as imposed from the outside on human beings. This is not a morality that arises from natural human empathy, natural human concern, or even a law of nature. It is simply a social construction that allows for the development of stable communities. So, the social contract theory of morality. Morality is a contract made so society can exist. Now, this early view of human nature was solidified, actually, in the cultural consciousness around the 19th century by misinterpretations, actually, of Darwin's theory of evolution. Charles Darwin, in 1859, published The Origin of the Species. And Charles Darwin suggested that evolution occurs through survival of the fittest. Now, in the 19th century mind, this idea of survival of the fittest was interpreted to mean survival of the powerful and the dominant. Therefore, it was believed that evolution occurred over time as those who were most able to conquer, those most able to destroy the weak, survived, and the weak died or disappeared. And so, as this view was adopted by the 19th century consciousness, it concretized an idea that had already existed since at least Thomas Hobbes, that morality was only there to alleviate the nature of human beings, which was natural warfare, and a state of nature in which the powerful dominated and destroyed the weak. This idea, however, has been called by Mary Midgley and others the pseudo-Darwinian thesis, because actually it is a misinterpretation of Darwin. Darwin actually did not say that survival of the fittest means survival of the powerful aggressor. So the pseudo-Darwinian thesis is survival of the fittest means survival of the powerful aggressor. But actually, Darwin had said that evolution occurs through natural selection. Natural selection is survival of the most able to adapt to the local environment. Okay, now this is quite a different vision of nature. Natural selection as opposed to survival of the fittest being interpreted as survival of the powerful and dominant. Because actually, a tremendous amount of evidence suggests that those most able to survive, that natural selection favors those able to cooperate as well as those able to compete. As a matter of fact, cooperation may outweigh competition in evolution. Think about it. What is the difference between my body and a single-celled organism? My body is composed of billions of organisms, of cells, cooperating to create a complex organism. What happens when one cell tries to dominate? We call that condition cancer. And what is the result? Death. Biological evolution occurs predominantly through the development of more and more complex levels of organization and cooperation. The same thing can be said of cultural evolution. If we look at human cultural evolution over time, each cultural advancement requires higher levels of cooperation. The hunt, agriculture, trade, all require high levels of cooperation. If we look at later civilizations, the institutions of civilization, like hospitals, universities, building bridges, building roads, these require high levels of cooperation. Therefore, it can be seen that this pseudo-Darwinian thesis of survival of the fittest as the powerful aggressor, the dominator, those who destroy the weak, is at best incomplete. Of course, this is not to say that human competition does not play a role in evolution. It most certainly does. Human cooperation, however, is crucial to our survival. And although there are manifold testaments to human competitiveness, destructiveness, violence, these are actually outweighed by evidence of human concern, care, empathy, and communion. If that were not so, we would not have survived as long as we have, and we would not have developed the level of civilization that we have. The fact that human empathy is a natural condition can be easily demonstrated by the answer that most of us would give to a very simple question. If I gave you the option, if I said to you, I will give you anything that your heart desires, all of your wishes will immediately come true with one condition. You must live entirely alone, and you cannot share with anyone. Would you accept that? No, of course you wouldn't. I have asked this question to hundreds of students, probably more than that, and not one student has ever said yes. Why? Because human beings need each other. We need each other to survive, and we need each other to thrive. A large part of human happiness is from human relationship. The fact is, as we saw in the last episode, we do share in the grief of a mother who lost her child. The fact is that there is something inside of us that hurts when we hear that 36,000 children are starving every day. The fact is that human empathy, care, and concern is natural to human beings, and it is an as important, if not more important, part of our evolution as competition is. Human empathy and sympathy can be demonstrated very easily by something else, something that we do every day, at least Americans do every day. We watch television, and we spend millions of dollars to go to the movies. And in the process, what happens as we sit in those darkened theaters? We lose ourselves in the lives of complete strangers. And we find ourselves caring about them. We boo and hiss and cheer and jeer and cry and laugh over what's happening to complete strangers. Nobody needs to tell us who to cheer for. Nobody needs to tell us who to boo for. Nobody needs to indicate who's the villain. Nobody needs to tell us who the hero is. We know, and we feel it deep inside of ourselves. And what's even more amazing than the fact that we care about these celluloid strangers is that if you look at the audience in a movie theater, someday turn around and really look. You'll see people of every age. All right, let's assume it's a really good movie. You'll see people of every age, every culture, religion, race, gender, all sorts of different people. And what's really amazing is they are laughing and crying and cheering and jeering at the same time. They're responding simultaneously and as a community to this emotional, cathartic experience that we call theater or film or television when we're home in a smaller group. That is really an amazing fact if you think about it. When a movie is really fabulous, it touches all levels of humanity. Think about Star Wars in that moment when Obi-Wan Kenobi's voice comes to Luke and he says, "Use the Force, Luke." Everybody's like, yeah! The entire audience. These are huge testaments to human empathy, human care, and human concern. We see it every day. We feel it every day. On top of all this evidence, the Hobbesian view of nature has been found to be very incomplete when we actually look at early human societies. Archaeological and mythological evidence from the early agricultural communities that developed in the fertile river valleys of India, the Near East, the Middle East, Old Europe. The archaeological evidence and the mythological evidence suggests that these were not warlike communities. In fact, the overwhelming evidence, I think, is that these were peaceful, egalitarian communities. And it seems that they worshipped a great mother goddess and actually a lineage of spiritual practice that can be traced back to the Neolithic. Now, this evidence is controversial. It's very controversial. However, this archaeological evidence has found no fortifications in these early agrarian communities. They have found no caches of weapons. They have found no damage from warfare, no signs of damage from warfare for millennium. They have found no depiction of warfare in art. And examination of grave wealth and distribution seems to show there is no differentiation in power between the sexes and, in fact, power between all peoples. And although controversial, the evidence does seem to suggest that these early communities were peaceful and egalitarian. And it was in these peaceful communities that the greatest advances in early technology and civilization were made. Now, this above evidence contradicts the Hobbesian view of nature, of course. This idea that the natural state of human beings was warlike doesn't seem to be borne by the evidence. Therefore, it seems that the Hobbesian view of nature fails the coherence test of truth. It doesn't fit in with our other beliefs. It also, as the above evidence should attest, it fails the experiential test of truth. It is not borne out by our experiences. And finally, it fails the pragmatic test of truth, because the Hobbesian view of nature does nothing to improve our lives or to improve the lives of those around us. So, as a singular view of nature, the Hobbesian view fails. However, obviously, it is not entirely false either. It is also true, as I said before, that there are manifold testaments to human competitiveness, human violence, and human greed. And these existed in the Neolithic times as well. It seems that in contrast to these peaceful, egalitarian, agrarian communities, there were also nomadic warrior tribes. Now, the mythologies of these nomadic warrior tribes seem to celebrate the traits of the warrior hero. It seemed also that they worshipped a male sun god. These nomadic tribes also developed weaponry, and it seems they first domesticated the horse. Now, as the agricultural communities flourished, and leisure time led to surpluses, and also as population growth led to competition for goods, it seems that in wave after wave of invasion, these nomadic warrior tribes swept down on the peaceful agrarian communities and conquered them. And this seems to have happened all over much of the known world. The evidence for these invasions includes the existence of the Indo-European language base. There's a similar language base all the way from India to Ireland. There is further evidence for these invasions in genetic evidence that seems to bear out that new tribes came down upon the old tribes in wave after wave of invasion, spanning actually millennia. And finally, the similarity in the myths, symbols, and rituals of these cultures spread all over the globe also seems to testify to the fact of these invasions. Now, the civilizations that developed between these two communities, between the nomadic patriarchal warrior invaders and the peaceful agrarian communities, the two civilizations combined to different degrees in different places. We do have evidence from all over the world that the old goddesses were married off to the newer patriarchal sun gods, and the newer communities that developed, for the most part, were patriarchal. Male dominance became the norm. Occasional warfare also became the norm, and for the most part, these societies were rigidly hierarchical in social structure. Private property characterized these societies, and slavery also characterized these societies. However, although there was extensive trade and warfare, life was still, for the most part, rural, tribal, agricultural, and familiar. Now, these very broad outlines describe life in the later Neolithic stages and actually reach into historical times. In other words, those times of which we have written evidence. So, to get back to the question of a social contract theory of morality, which now should seem to be highly disputable, perhaps rather than referring to a Hobbesian view of nature or a pseudo-Darwinian thesis to understand the rise of morality, perhaps morality can be better understood as arising from two sides of human nature that are to some extent actually symbolized by these two forces, the nomadic warrior tribes and the peaceful agrarian tribes. Because as we look at human nature and society, it seems undoubtable that all around us and within us, there are two competing forces. There's the drive, yes, to dominate and compete. After all, as I said before, those movies that we go to see every day are about conflict. We empathize and sympathize together, but the movies are about conflict. So within us, yes, we find a desire to compete and to dominate. On the other hand, also within us is this empathy that is natural, and also the desire to commune with one another. And perhaps morality can best be understood as an attempt to mediate between these two inner and outer forces. And in addition, within us, we are torn between those selfish acts that seem to be in our self-interest and those unselfish acts which also seem to be in our self-interest. So perhaps morality can best be understood as our attempt to mediate between these opposing impulses within ourselves and when we encounter them in others. Morality is about how we act and react to those competing impulses, and thus our moral decisions are our pursuit of wisdom, to find the best way to live the best possible life in those actions and in those reactions. Of course, in these early societies, human beings were not confronted with the huge existential questions that we are confronted with today. They did not have to decide who to marry. They didn't have to decide what career to have. They didn't have to decide how many children to have. In fact, leaders or nature dictated these. Life was much simpler in these times, although much of nature seemed to function by fate or necessity, as did the movement of the stars, the cycle of the seasons. All of these seem to occur as part of the natural order, as part of fate. But on the other hand, much of life seemed to be subject to the will of these gods and goddesses. And thus it seemed to be rather random and chaotic, because it seemed that the will of the gods and goddesses could be changed. And therefore, in these early communities, people sought to control their lives by seeking the favor of the gods and goddesses. They also sought to avoid their wrath. In these times, life was seen as infused with magic and spirit. Priestesses and priests could go into trance and commune with the deities and come back with divine revelation. They could heal and prophesy the future. And during these times, moral law and civil law were both handed down by these spiritual and political leaders. In the Neolithic times, and even in the later Neolithic times, morality was a matter of law, tradition, divine command, and culture. However, a change came about in the 5th and 6th century BC. In the 5th and 6th century BC, ethical philosophies were developed almost simultaneously all over the world. In the 5th and 6th century BC, Lao Tzu will teach in China, Confucius will teach in China, Buddha will teach in India, Zoroaster will teach in Persia. In the Middle East, the final touches will be put on the Torah and thus lay the foundation for the Judeo-Christian tradition. And in Greece, Western philosophy will be born. So, of course, the question is, what happened? Why all of a sudden at this period did all these ethical philosophies arise? And the answer is, in part, it's a mystery. In part, it's too complex to cover here. And in part, the answer is very simple. The old ways just weren't working like they used to. Tradition, law, religion, and culture were no longer sufficient to answer the question, how ought I live? And because of that, these new ethical philosophies arose. And so now we're going to start looking at these ethical theories that arose in the 5th and 6th century BC, when life was no longer answered by tradition, religion, culture, and law alone. And thus, philosophy became necessary. And so, for Chapter 5, we're going to explore Taoism. We're going to begin our exploration of ethical philosophies with Lao Tzu, who lived around 575 BC in China. But before we begin to study the ethical philosophy of Lao Tzu, we have to first explore the human mind, because the mind is a tool that we will be using to explore philosophy. We have to begin by understanding our own minds. So, in order to explore our minds, I want you to do a little exercise for me. What I would like you to do in just a few minutes is simply close your eyes and watch your thoughts arise. I don't want you to direct your thoughts or decide what you're going to think about. I simply want you to take note of what you're thinking about. See, the fact is, we think thousands of thoughts every day. They just seem to arise into our mind. So I just want you to take a few minutes, 1 minute actually, close your eyes and watch these thoughts arise and see what comes up for you. Just take note. It's a very simple exercise. Okay, close your eyes. Okay, open your eyes. Did that seem like a long time? It's 1 minute. Seems like an eternity when you're on TV in dead airspace for 1 minute. Now, that might have been very difficult for you because we're not often used to watching our own thoughts. Even though we think all day long, we're not often aware of what we are thinking. We're simply just thinking. However, I want you to ask a few questions about those thoughts. Whatever they happen to be, even if you just sat there and thought, is thinking about whether I'm thinking about my thoughts, this can be very difficult, right? Just think of the thoughts that you had, if you were able to take note of them. And let me ask you a few questions. For this meditation exercise, where do your thoughts come from? Think about it. These thoughts arise into your mind. Where do they come from? Where do they go? Once a thought has been thought, what happens to it? Who or what decides on what you're going to think? Think about it. If you're not deciding to think about something, about doing your philosophy homework, for instance, then what is deciding what you're going to think about? Why is one person thinking about, oh, my toe hurts, another person thinking, I'm hungry, and another person thinking, oh, gosh, last Christmas wasn't very fun? What are the thoughts? What decides what you're going to think about? Okay, how about this one? What is the nature of your thoughts? When you began watching your thoughts, were you anxious? Were you thinking, am I doing this exercise correctly? I wonder if this is what she's asking me to do? Or were your thoughts perhaps judgmental? This is a stupid exercise. I'm not even going to do it. Or did you perhaps go into stress? Did you start to make a list of things that you should be doing rather than watching your thoughts? Whatever the nature of your thoughts were, whether they were stressed or they were judgmental or they were bored, what was the nature? And is the nature of your thoughts your nature? Are you stressed? Are you judgmental? Are you boring? If your thoughts have a certain nature, is the nature determined by your nature? Okay. And think about this. If you were really able to watch your thoughts, how is the nature of the thought determined? But also, if you are watching your thoughts, are you the one thinking the thoughts or are you the one watching the thoughts? Or is there two of you? Okay, now this may seem like very complex questions. But the fact is you think all day long. As I said before, you think thousands and thousands of thoughts all day long. You're walking through the hall and you think, oh, I have to get my lunch ready and I have to pick up the kids. And oh my gosh, what is she wearing? All day long, you're thinking and thinking and thinking. In fact, our thought processes are our most immediate experience of ourselves. We hear ourselves thinking all day long. We're not looking in a mirror all day long. At least I hope you're not. So you don't see yourself all day long. But these thoughts are your experience of yourself. Your most intimate and immediate experience of yourself. And yet, most of us are not even aware of the process. We've never even questioned it. Many people have never even observed it. This simple exercise is an exercise in becoming aware of your thinking process, of becoming aware of your awareness, or conscious of your consciousness. So think about this. This effort to become aware of awareness, consciousness of consciousness, which simply begins with the ability to watch your thoughts. And why is it so important? So that we can understand the nature of our thoughts, because their nature is our nature. Our thoughts, as I said before, are our most immediate experience of ourself. So, let's look at the nature of thought. This simple awareness of awareness exercise I've given you is beginning of what is called Vipassana meditation. It is an awareness meditation in which one begins to watch their thoughts in order to become, at first, aware of their nature. Well, if you would continue an awareness meditation, you would find, as I said before, that you are thinking all day long. Your thoughts are chattering away at you all day long. They never shut up. They just go on and on. Whatever you're doing, wherever you are, your thoughts are going on and on and on and on in your head. Talking away at you. Never being silent. Always going. So, the first aspect of mind, the nature of thought, it is constant chattering. If a friend did that, you would dump the friend. But even more than that, if you look and listen, well, listen actually, to the nature of your thoughts, you will find that they are often negative. I know that may seem surprising to some of you, but if you listen to your own thoughts, you will find that many, many of your thoughts are about fear. We are afraid of, will this person like me? How am I going to pay my debt? Gosh, I wonder if I'm going to get fired from my job. Our thoughts are fearful. We fear what may happen to us, and our thoughts can plague us with those fears. We're worrying about being liked. We're worrying about how we look. We're worrying about how others view us. We're worrying about money. We're worrying about our health. We're worrying, and so we drive ourselves absolutely insane. That is often the nature of our thoughts. And when we're not worrying, our thoughts are often judgmental. In fact, a great many of our thoughts we spend judging ourselves incredibly harshly. We're usually beating ourselves up for our own inadequacies. And when we're not beating ourselves up for our own inadequacies, we're judging other people. Ugh, terrible outfit. Oh, what was he thinking when he put that on? Or, oh, I can't stand that guy. Or, oh, I want that. Isn't that beautiful? Our minds are judging and judging and judging and judging and judging, but most of the time, that judgmental nature is negative. We spend a tremendous amount of time beating ourselves up and beating other people up in our minds. And the odd thing about this is this thought process is seemingly out of our control. We're not deciding to think this way. We're not deciding to be afraid. We're not deciding to be judgmental. It just almost automatically happens. As we're walking through our day, as we're walking down the hall, as we're getting into our car, we're thinking, oh my gosh, I have to get this done, I have to get that done. What's going to happen to me? Where are we? And we don't seem to be able to control it or stop it. So, our thoughts are seemingly out of control. Now, I know that you have had the experience of not being able to get to sleep at night. Some of you, it happens to regularly. Some only once in a while. But there's no question that you have laid there in bed, completely controlled by your own thoughts, unable to shut off your mind, kept awake, and it is not positive thoughts that are keeping you awake. Most of the time, it is horrible fears and anxieties and angers that are keeping you awake. So this thought process not only comes from we don't know where and has this negative nature that we didn't decide upon, it grasps us and controls us. I know, everybody thinks it's just them. You thought it was just you. Well, here's the news. It's everybody. It's the nature of thought itself. Not only is the thought constantly chattering, often negative, seemingly out of control, but in addition, thoughts are almost always about the past or about the future. If you watch your thoughts, you will find that much of your time is spent regretting or resenting the past. I can't believe I did that. I wish I had. I could have. We have insane conversations about what we wish we had said to someone. There's a fabulous French expression called esprit d'escalier. And it actually means ghosts on the stairway. And esprit d'escalier, which is in my terrible French, actually is about all those things that we wish we had said when we left a room. We become haunted by the past. And even when we look back and the memories are positive, it's always bittersweet, even if it is positive, because what we're looking at is over. It's past. It's gone. So even the wonderful things about the past cannot be entirely positive. And when we're not thinking about the past, we're thinking about the future. And what are we doing when we think about the future? That's right. We're scared of the future most of the time. We're scared about our health. We're scared about what's going to happen to our finances. We're worried about our relationships. We're worried about our job. We're worried about that philosophy paper. We're worried about the future. And so the past and the future is where our mind goes, but the amazing thing is only one thing is ever really happening, and that's now. So to the extent that our thoughts are dragging us into the past or pushing us into the future, we're not present. In the Gospels, Jesus called the past and the future thieves because they steal the only thing that is real, which is the present. So this is pretty amazing if you think about it. As you begin to recognize the nature of your thoughts, you will find that they are constantly chattering, often negative, out of control, and bringing you into the past and future. This is exactly why awareness of awareness is so important, because this negative nature of mind, now you may doubt me on this, that this is true, but this negative nature of mind has been noted by the philosophers, the saints, the poet, and the sages throughout history. And it is not until you become aware of this negative nature that you can do anything about it, that you would seek to intervene or control or stop it. Now this should be an amazing revelation that our most immediate experience of ourselves is this negative mind, chattering away at us all day long. So this is the first thing that we can learn about the mind, that it is following around. Now let us continue to explore the mind, and I want to do this by doing another really simple exercise. All I want you to do is close your eyes and picture a tree. Picture any tree. Get as clear a picture as possible of that tree. You should be able to do this because our mind takes pictures all the time. Okay. Answer question. What tree did you picture? Here's some of the trees that students have told me they pictured. Plumeria, coconut, whispering willow, oak, Christmas tree, a big funny children's tree from a comic book. What kind of tree did you picture? Well, the first thing you should note is that you can't picture tree. You can only picture a tree. You can picture a plumeria, a coconut, a whispering willow, an oak, a Christmas tree. You can picture these. You can't picture tree. Now, the particular tree that you pictured is relative to you. In other words, it's dependent on your experience of trees. It is very rare that someone from Hawaii will picture an oak tree. It is equally rare for someone from New York to picture a mango or a bamboo or a coconut. So the particular tree that you pictured is relative. But everybody out there understood what I meant when I said tree. But what is tree? Tree is a mental category. Tree is an abstraction. Tree, a mental category which captures the essence shared by all trees. Plumerias, coconuts, oaks, Christmas trees all have something about them called treeness. And the category tree is where we mentally file all our individual experiences of trees. It is how we can conveniently locate tree, and is how we can understand, in a sense, our experience of trees. You see, our mind labels and categorizes everything that it experiences. Plumeria, coconut, label. Tree, category. All right, so now let's look at exactly what the mind does when we have an experience. Let's say an experience of a tree. I have an experience of a tree. What is the very first thing that my mind does with that experience? Well, the very first thing my mind does is it divides that experience. The dividing mind. Every experience that I have, the mind divides into the subject, the experiencer, and the object being experienced, in this case, a tree. This should seem very obvious to you. Every experience, there is the experiencer and that which is experienced. You do not say, I feel hunger. Oh no. You do not say, there's hunger going on. You say, I am hungry. I am hungry. You do not say, a roller coaster ride happened. You said, I went on a roller coaster, or I had a roller coaster ride. And this is true of every experience the mind has. First of all, we have the experience, then we divide it into the experiencer and the experience. In this case, a tree. What is the very next thing the mind does? Well, it labels. In this case, oak. Let's say I'm experiencing an oak tree. My mind labels that experience. This is an oak. And other trees might be plumerias or coconuts or palms or banyans, but my mind has a label for it, and then my mind categorizes that experience. It puts it into this file called tree. There's a reason that the mind does this labeling and categorizing. It's extremely important. As a matter of fact, what is the first job that God gave to Adam in the Bible? Do you know? It is to label everything. God told Adam to name everything. Well, this story may have many different meanings to many different people, but one of the meanings of this story is the birth of the reasoning mind, because the ego mind thinks by labels, by names, and by categories. So we see the label and categorizing mind, the first thing it does, label, oak. Category, tree. Simple. So why does the mind need to do this? I'm going to put a picture up on the screen, and I just want you to tell me how many dots are in this picture. That should have taken you about 5 seconds, right? Not even. Immediately, you should be able to tell me there are 5 dots. All right, let's see how many dots are in the next picture. That's right, 15 dots, like that. Okay, one last picture. How many dots are in this picture? Ah, this one takes some time, right? The first picture, immediately, you could say 5. The second picture, immediately, you could say 15, because they were 5 organized and categorized very neatly. The third picture actually has 14 dots. But because they're individual and random, the mind has to handle them one by one. And so the mind slows down. It has to count 1, 2, 3. There's actually less dots in the last picture than there were in the second picture. But because they weren't organized, because they weren't categorized, the mind had to deal with them one by one. See, the mind can't do that. And we experience billions of things every day. Some of the mind shuts out completely. Those experiences we take note of become labeled and categorized. That is so that we can think about them. Okay, so what does the mind do after it labels and categorizes? The very next thing the mind does, first it separates I and it, the experiencer and the experience, labels, categorizes, and then the mind judges. Every experience that we have, the mind begins to judge. The mind judges whether it is good or bad, beautiful or ugly, true or false. If you think about every experience you have, some judgment is almost automatic in that experience. For instance, my tree, I may think, such a beautiful tree. Or perhaps I think, ugly tree, in my way, want to cut it down. Either way, I will have some judgment about the tree, almost automatically. And this leads to the next thing that the mind does. Because once the mind labels and categorizes and judges, it then begins to desire. I want something from that. I notice For imagine my encounter with my tree. I want something from my tree. If it really comes into notice for me, I want to climb it, or I want to rest in its shade. I want to chop it down. I want to paint it. I want to write a poem about it. Actually, there's a really wonderful book by Shel Silverstein called The Giving Tree. It's a children's book. Wisdom is found in many different places. Well, in this book by Shel Silverstein, it is about the relationship between a boy and a tree through many, many years. And every time the boy comes to the tree, he wants something. And of course, the tree loves the boy, so she gives it to him. And when he's young, he wants to play in her branches and make a crown of leaves so that he can be king. But of course, he grows up. And the next time he comes to the tree, he's a young man and he wants the tree's apples so he can sell them in the market and have money. And then, sometime after that, he comes back and he is a bit older and he wants a home. And so he cuts down the branches of the tree so he can build his home. And then a while after that, he comes back and he's a middle-aged man. And at this point, he's kind of tired and unhappy and he wants to sail away. And so this time he cuts the tree and he takes the tree's trunk and he creates a boat and he sails away. And finally, much, much later, he comes back as an old man. And he's really tired and worn out now. And the tree, well, the tree is just a stump. But of course, what does an old man want? Nothing more than a stump to sit on. Now, this story by Shel Silverstein has many messages in it. But one of those messages is that it really captures the desire nature of the human mind. Because the mind labels, judges, labels, categorizes, judges, desires, and then we begin to manipulate to fulfill our desires. Now, the labeling mind certainly has its uses. It has been used to create or discover many of the conveniences that we call civilization. In fact, I have been using the labeling mind to describe the labeling mind to you. And so it also very successfully points to our experiences and our emotions. But the labeling mind also has its limitations. And so to understand these limitations, let us look at this process that the labeling mind goes through. First of all, as I said, the first thing that happens when I encounter something, my tree, I divide it into I, the experiencer, and the object, the tree. I separate and divide. Think about this. Are the tree and I really separate? The tree, its roots go down into the soil and it brings up water and through its branches, and then it lets this water go into the atmosphere, and then this water comes down as rain. And that rain becomes the streams and rivers that I drink from and I bathe in. The tree is pulling in oxygen, pulling in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. I am breathing in oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide. The tree and I breathe each other. The tree and I are utterly interdependent and dependent upon one another. This separation is something my mind imposes on the relationship. In fact, we are utterly interdependent. Now, if you cut down any particular tree, there's no problem. However, if you cut down the rainforest, we won't be able to breathe. Now let's look at this labeling, categorizing function of the mind. I label the tree, and I think that I said something. I've turned it into an object, and I think now that I know something. But the fact is the tree an object? Do I now know something by this label, oak, this category, tree that I have made? The tree is, in fact, a process. It's an extraordinarily complex process. Not only pulling in water and releasing it from its branches, it's dropping leaves and growing bark and dropping bark. It is pulling in sunlight, and in a billion chemical reactions, it is creating energy. And that energy is the energy that fuels the earth. It is bringing up minerals from the ground in a relationship with a million rhizomes and converting those minerals into its very bark, into its very leaves. What does my label capture of that? And next episode, we'll come back and we'll discuss that. The difference between the experience and the label in our exploration of the mind. Until then, bye-bye. Have a great night. See you next time.